جشن امردادگاه پایندگی جاودان امردادم شد نشان پاکی از ما سر به بلند آزاد.
Welcome to Your World, a program about whatever is international at Central. I'm your host, Steve Horowitz. Today's show is about a country that has been in the news quite a bit over the last year, and a country that has been, I would say, negatively in the American psyche probably for the last 3 decades. The country is Iran. And my guest today on our show to talk about Iran is Professor Khodi Kaviani, a CW education professor. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be with you and with the audience.
And tell us a little bit first about your background. Of course, you're originally from Iran. That's why you're here to talk about Iran. But a little bit about your specialization, how long you've been at Central.
Thanks. I've been at Central for the past 3 years. I'm in the College of Education. I teach the social studies methods courses as well as ed foundations. My main primary focus is on democratic education. I came to the United States when I was about 16 years old. And that was right after the revolution. And initially we thought, well, it's going to be just a few years and then we can go back. But the revolution really changed my life and the lives of millions of other Iranians. So at this time, Ellensburg is home and Seattle is home and Washington is our home.
What, given the media, perspective that Americans have, what are some of the things that you think are not accurately portrayed and what Americans would benefit by understanding better?
There are, where do I begin? The area of misconceptions, you find evidence of that in the media as well as in what is taught in schools. For example, this is one of the books I brought to show. This is a book called The Choices Program that's put out by Brown University, supposed to be a very high quality work. And what we find is in this book, the only real image of Middle East is the artist's rendition of what life was like in the Middle East in the 18th century.
Now, when was this
or
book
in the
written?
19th century.
This is a recent book?
Right. This is what is used and what is promoted as something that teachers should use in American public schools. And the idea of misconception, one can argue that it goes both ways. For most Americans, when they think about the era of hostility between the two countries, it starts with the hostage crisis and of 1979, late 1979. With Iranians, it starts with 1953, the CIA and British engineered coup that brought the Shah back to power and overthrew Prime Minister Mossadegh's regime.
Which I think is more widely known now, but still probably lots of Americans don't know the roots of the antagonism that Iranians felt towards the U.S. from the 50s.
Right. This whole idea of historical memory is an issue. And when Hollywood gets involved and redefines history with a really offensive movie like 300 that the images are have no base in real history. I visited some high schools and the students, and I heard this from the teacher as well as the students, that the amount of information they learn about Iran, most of it really comes from these types of movies that they watch. And the portion that is dedicated to a reasonable study of Iranian history tends to be very thin in what appears in history textbooks. So all of that set aside, the idea of what people really should know about Iran is difficult to summarize in this short program. But certainly people need to understand that Iran, one of the nice things about the recent events, the election controversy that happened, perhaps one can argue the best good news in all of that was the world saw that there is a distinction between the Iranian people and the theocracy, or some argue is thugocracy, that exists in Iran. And this distinction has made people realize maybe we should take a closer look at the customs, traditions, values of the Iranian people, not what the regime is promoting.
Because very often when we see here in the U.S. some image, before the recent election controversy, people in the streets in Iran, and we see, chants of death to America, we don't really know how widespread are the feelings expressed by these people, and is it this stage of the of the relationship between the two countries and the election controversy, is that just for the cameras, or is there a large segment of the Iranian population that still feels the hostility that goes back to 1950s and the hostage crisis? How do you read that?
Well, that's an excellent question. I don't think I know the full answer to that, but what we can say for sure is anytime you bring in the cameras, the level of excitement in the population goes up, and we need to recognize that the people who are doing these chants, they are the ones who have been bussed in by the government, and it's a ritual that it has outlived its usefulness at this time.
Because it seems that what we've seen recently among a lot of the people who've been in the streets and protesting against the election and the current regime there is much less hostility towards the West and much more interest in reestablishing some sort of connection.
Right. People are not afraid of the regime anymore. That's another nice thing that is happening in Iran. People are really emphasizing this notion of nonviolent street demonstrations to protest the oppression that exists in the country currently. For example, when people were chanting, giving anti-US, anti-Israeli, anti-British slogans to streets from the US Embassy, people were chanting down with China and Russia and a whole array of other slogans that really had nothing to do with the United States. In fact, they were chanting Obama, Obama, ya ba una, ya ba ma, meaning,
which means, yeah.
which means Obama, Obama, you are either with them or you are with us. So clearly the nature of slogans are changing, and they are communicating a message as well, that people are aware that their voices are being heard, and the green movement that we see in Iran is truly an indigenous movement that is surpassing all classes.
So there are, of course, a lot, as we've just been referring to, a lot of misconceptions that Americans have about Iran, very limited amount of information, very skewed information. What about the ideas that Iranians have about America, about American society, or about American attitudes? Do you think there is better information on the Iranian side about this culture? Of course, a lot of Iranians have relatives here. Many have been here, have studied here, whereas not that many Americans have been to Iran.
Well, Iran, given its geopolitical position in the Middle East, they are naturally curious about the outside world. And in Iran, they do listen to Radio Moscow, BBC, Voice of America, and a whole array of other radio stations that beam into the country constantly. And through satellite, they are able to get news and information that wasn't available to them prior to that time. So there is not a shortage of information. And Iranians, one can argue, it has become a national character, that they are mistrusting of government news.
Another thing I think that would be informative just to mention is the very large population of Iranians, Iranian Americans, and others who've come here from Iran. I think the U.S. has maybe the largest, is that right? The largest Iranian population outside of Iran?
That I don't know, but I won't be surprised.
One of the largest, certainly.
I won't be surprised if that's the case. In California, there are areas that is referred to commonly as Tehran Jealous, like you have Los Angeles, now there's Tehran Jealous, and there are very large, extensive communities of Iranian Americans in this country, and they have done pretty well. And of course, there are millions, really, of Iranians who go back to Iran and then they leave the country to visit other places. So Iran is an open system. It's an open country. And when you think about number of cell phones that people have, pretty much for every Iranian there is a cell phone. If they want one, they can get one.
So there's a lot of information now today going from the U.S. back to Iran about what's happening here via people and via electronics.
Yes.
Now, I know that one of your areas of interest particularly is pre-Islamic Iran. And I think probably would be good for you to give us a little introduction, because probably in this society it's not well known that there's a whole long history and roots of Iranian culture in the time before Islam came from the Arab world to Iran.
Thank you. The idea of Iran always being an Islamic state, Islamic country, is absolutely false. About 1400 years ago, when Islam was brought to Iran, some argue that the current regime is another invasion by the Arabs of the Iranian land and decimation of the Iranian culture. What we find is in the pre-Islamic Iran, many ideas existed that promote human rights, free speech, clear thinking, and these ideas are really nothing new to the Iranian people. In particular, when we read about the Zoroaster, the first the person who brought monotheism to the world, his idea was, let us question our own mind first, our own assumptions first, and it's okay to question God, it's okay to question the creation, it's okay to question what should happen to someone who has done something wrong to another individual who brought up these issues that deal with social justice. And part of his ideology was the idea that man is free. Any human being is born free and has the option of choosing between good path and bad path.
So Zoroaster is a key figure, maybe the most important single figure in pre-Islamic Iran that I think is, I would say, not very well known outside of Iran, perhaps in people who study comparative religion. But for those who have a strong connection and interest, like you do, in the religion and culture before Islam, I mean, Zoroaster is key.
Right, and for many Iranians, this is another side benefit of the Islamic Republic, is Iranians are beginning to ask themselves, who am I? What does it mean to be Iranian? And they are realizing that they need to trace their cultural roots, not so much to Islam, but to what Iran was before Islam came to town. And that is the, perhaps one can argue, is really an enlightening revolution that's happening inside the country.
Because some of the ideas you mentioned seem to be at odds with what most of us think of as ideas that are important parts of Islam, the ideas that Zoroaster was teaching.
Absolutely. One idea is the notion of equality of genders. Men and women are equal. And that reflects even the name of creator in Zoroaster's ideology, which is Ahura Mazda, which means life-giving, wise one, which has the feminine and masculine characteristics all combined into this name. And the second characteristics is good thoughts. So the idea of good thoughts becomes central in this way of life, this way of thinking, which means you must always be rational. You must always consider best case fair hearing of competing viewpoints, which means you really have to be able to analyze them, analyze the evidence before you. And it's very different than indoctrination, where you have to follow something blindly. Blind and sheepish following of any ideology is not acceptable, is not accepted in true Iranian culture.
And this highlights a point that may be superficial in some ways, but I think for Iranians in the U.S. could be important for Americans to understand that there is a big difference between Arab culture and Iranian culture, and the language of Iran, Farsi, is completely different from Arabic, although the influence from Arabic right after Islam has been strong. Because there are a lot of people who don't really, as you pointed out by looking at that book on the Middle East, just use a broad brush to paint all of the people and the culture of the Middle East, not understanding that Iran has completely separate characteristics and history and language. Am I correct in that?
You're absolutely correct. In fact, it may not be a bad idea to bring up this image one more time. The whole title of this particular book is Shifting Sands. So the image that comes to mind again, going back to that stereotyping, here is desert and the people are running in deserts and things of that sort, which is absolutely false. Iran, for example, is something close to 70% urbanized.
And the population today?
And the population is somewhere in the range of 66, 67 million people. So you're dealing with an urbanized, highly urbanized and educated population that is young, because after the revolution, and especially during the Iran-Iraq War, Khomeini told young people, go and procreate and have children. Well, they did. And now Iran is having this young bubble that's coming to surface. And these are the people that did not know Shah, but they certainly know theocracy and oppression when they see one. And since my area of specialty is education, it's interesting to point out some of the characteristics of theocracy. This one is to teach Persian for first grade. And what's interesting is all these books, they begin with the picture of Khomeini, the deceased leader of the Islamic Revolution. Now, what's interesting is you also find his image on money. And perhaps the single most characteristics, if you're looking for the tip of the iceberg, to give you a clue, if you go to a country that you see the leader's image is on the money, it's on the first page of any book, textbook you open up, you know something is fishy here.
Wasn't that the same for the Shah? The Shah's picture was in all of the books.
Absolutely.
On every wall.
Absolutely. And this notion of cult of personality is totally, it goes against the notion of democratic education and creating a democratic society where you want people to value ideas, not so much a person, but it's the ideas that endure.
But hasn't Iranian history been filled with strong leaders, kings of one kind or another, and has not had many periods of democracy?
True. However, we need to recognize that Iran has a long tradition of monarchy, and when the monarch, he's a good thinking monarch, he's able to end up running a system that tends to be, given the technology of the time, as tolerating as possible. Cyrus the Great, for example, he was the first Iranian who created promoted the idea of human rights in the world.
We're talking about like more than 2,000 years ago?
2,500 years ago, yes. But those are the ideas that have endured in Iran. Iranians are quite sensitive when it comes to recognizing the ideas of justice, injustice in society, tolerance in society. And something else.
Well, that certainly would give us, in America, a lot of insight into how a lot of people are feeling these days with what happened during the election.
And along with the topic of election, let me share with you this information here. As part of, again, theocracy that happens, this is lesson number 7, and what we see is, again, the image of Khomeini pops up on page 62 of the textbook. Now, this may be nothing strange, but then again, you see it again on lesson 20. Here's a child kissing the cheeks of Khomeini. Now, one could wonder, what does that have to do with learning how to teach and write? Now, this is for first grade. Now, as you move up the grades, you will see that this idea continues. Any textbook that we pick up, this one in particular is about teaching Islamic culture and religious teachings in Iran. And again, you open up the first book, lo and behold, what do you see? He might be quite a handsome guy, but the question is, does it need to be on every page of the first page that you open up in a textbook?
What about teaching? You mentioned, the teachings of Islam. We know that Iran has an Islamic government. What about the teachings of pre-Islamic Iran that you talked about, the teachings of Zoroaster, some of the ideas that you mentioned a few minutes ago? Are those contained in school books today, or have the ideas of Islam just completely covered those over?
Let's say if there is a mention of that, it would be less than one sentence. And what we find instead are a whole course dedicated to Islamic teachings. And this is section 4 of the book, and the title of it is the Prophet of Islam, and he's labeled as the last messenger that God sent. So automatically, any other prophet, anyone else who considers himself or people consider him to be a prophet, they are not eligible. And Baha'is in Iran are falling under this category. And you continue reading this book, you begin to see some interesting concepts, such as whatever you want in heaven, just ask for it, you get it.
Which was probably a concept that helped push a lot of those poor kids who died in the Iran-Iraq war to just march into battle without any real preparation, believing this was awaiting them.
Sure. And of course, anytime you're fighting for the defense of your country, that's a whole different story. And all regimes use whatever tool available to them to excite the people and rally them around the flag and so forth. But I can see that being used on a limited basis for the defense of the country, and that's fine. Whatever promise you want to give him a key to heaven, you want to give him whatever you want to give him, do so. But when you try to teach that as part of a regular curriculum, school curriculum that people have to actually take a test to pass, then we have entered into the era of official knowledge, which is based on theocracy, which is based on religion, which is absolutely imposed on the population. That means if you don't have the right religion, you are not going to rise through the ranks. When you want to enter the university, you are going to run into problems. And if you are not, as part of the official religions, recognized religions, then you might as well pack your bag and leave the country. And the regime has been quite willing to do that. In fact, they have opened the door, say, leave, please leave.
So where are we now as we seem to be headed into a period of maybe uncertainty, greater signs of outward dissatisfaction with the government? Where do you see Iran moving or possibly going in the next 5 to 10 years?
I'm extremely hopeful for the country. I think Iranians have reached a point where they are quite mature in their political outlook. They are not looking for another revolution. They are looking for gradual changes that will improve the lives of Iranians who are inside the country. And Green Movement is an example of that. The notion of Islamic Republic There is a religious element, and then there is the Republican element of that. That's the democracy portion of it, which has been weakened in this latest round. And of course, anytime you have these thugs, the Basijis, there is really no other term for that. When they are beating the population, oppressing the people, oppressing their freedom of speech, there is absolutely no justification for any support for such a regime.
So it's important, I think, that you seem to be saying that for Americans, we look now for what is important for Americans to understand maybe about Iran, that it's not an entire population that is hostile to the U.S., and that Iranians are yearning to a great extent to break free of the chains that this Islamic government regime has wrapped around them, and that it would be maybe useful for Americans to understand what is going on over there.
Absolutely. In fact, if there are any in the audience who are interested in going to Iran, it's a wonderful opportunity for them to go there, because what they are going to find is Iran, unlike any other country in the Middle East, is extremely receptive to the Americans.
Do you think this is not a bad time for Americans to try to take a trip to Iran?
Absolutely not. It's a great time. You can go there, and you can be part of a tour. If you are not really comfortable, you can be part of a tour. And Iran has numerous historical sites that are absolutely really breathtaking.
And most recently, the Rick Steves show on PBS had really presented a very different image of Iran to the American people, which I think is great to start to break down some of the stereotypes.
Yes, breaking down the stereotypes is a good first step. And of course, so long as the political knot has not been untangled, it's going to be difficult for the animosity that exists at governmental level, really, to disappear. And and of course, during all that time, people-to-people contacts, I'm strongly in favor of that. I think that's the way to promote understanding between cultures, and always peaceful resolution to any type of disagreements is preferred. That's what we teach in schools, and there is absolutely no reason why we can't apply those same principles to international disputes.
Well, you've done a lot today by giving us a lot of information and insight into what's going on today in Iran and what Iran was like before the Islamic Revolution, what the ideas were that existed then and still exist today. I think it's given us a lot to think about, and I hope it's maybe given some people a different perspective and maybe a desire to learn more by looking at a lot of resources that are available, including some of your own work, which is, you have a website that people can go to actually to listen to some of your music and some of the information about pre-Islamic Iran?
Yes, they can always go to www.khodi.com, Khodi.com, and they can listen to various songs. In fact, this particular CD is Ancient Whispers. This was the first CD that I produced. Part of the objective for this was to really preserve the Iranian culture before it gets destroyed or forgotten. So this is another way to remember, why do people celebrate the New Year? Why do people value fire? Why do people value water? And all those holidays that we have, even the holiday in the West, Valentine's Day. Well, there is an Iranian equivalent of that. The fourth of something equivalent to a trick-or-treating that happens during Halloween. Well, we have one called Chasham Basuri, and there's a song associated with that. So one can really see the roots of many Western holidays and traditions, even Christmas. It has its roots in the Iranian holiday of Jashn Daygan. Day means creator, so the celebration for the creation, Shab Yalda, when you have the longest night of the year, And the idea is sun is born on such a day. So from that day, that night on, we have days becoming longer and longer, so we celebrate light. More importantly, all of these cultures, all these holidays, what they show us is that there is a universal thread that connects us all together. It is that humanity that binds you and I and everybody else together. And that's what these holidays promote and they highlight.
And that's a great way to end today's discussion. Khodi, thanks so much for being my guest.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
And we'll see you next time on Your World.
روز اورمزد